Nick married Jolie 3 years ago, but he wouldn't have done so if she hadn't become the sole owner of the business following her father's sudden death. Her father, a seemingly young and strong businessman, died unexpectedly from a stroke. Jolie was Mr. Macmillan's only child and the sole heir to his fortune. This is why Nick, a handsome slacker accustomed to living off women, took an interest in her. Jolie was captivated by Nick's charming promises while he planned to stay with her until a more profitable opportunity arose. However, it soon became clear that the most favorable option, the jackpot of his life, was Jolie. She inherited her father's colossal wealth, and Nick knew exactly how to take advantage of it. He believed he could easily manipulate her deep affection for him to control her fortune, and everything was going as well as possible for Nick. The girl was deeply grieving. Her father had been her pillar of support and the most significant person in her life. So, Nick quickly surrounded Jolie with care and support during such a hard time. The young and naive girl was unaware that the worst moment of her life had spurred Nick to hide his true nature even more. At least until their wedding, he maintained his good behavior, ensuring there was no turning back. After the funeral, he proposed marriage, suggesting they wait until her mourning period for her father was over. Nick was adept at deception, manipulation, and pretense. He could become whoever he needed to be and do whatever was expected of him. With his wealthy girlfriends, he typically didn't put in much effort, thinking there would always be another wealthy woman. With Jolie, the name was worth it, the efforts would not be in vain, and the cunning man clearly understood it. But the first hurdle for him came unexpectedly from a source he couldn't have foreseen. Jolie's father had a best friend who was also his main deputy in the company and godfather to Jolie. Mr. Chinland understood right away that Jolie was head over heels in love and wouldn't be dissuaded from marriage. Her grief over losing her father made her seek a replacement, but as an intelligent and shrewd man, Mr. Chinland categorically insisted on a prenuptial agreement, and he managed to win Jolie over to his side. "Nick, it's for business. Is it that hard?" Jolie asked, repeating what Mr. Chinland had told her. "This is humiliating." "Do you think I need your money?" the man retorted, indignant at this turn of events. Honey, it's just a formality. We only need it in case of divorce. My godfather really wants us to sign it. He's always been like a second father to me," Jolie explained. Jolie may have been naive about financial matters, given that she'd never had to worry about money, but she wasn't a fool in other respects. When she set a goal, she achieved it no matter what. Nick was pinned against the wall and had to agree to all of Mr. Chinland's terms. The marriage contract formulation was standard, but it curtailed Nick's rights completely. It was evident that the business and all other property inherited from Jolie's father could not become joint property of the spouses. Nick assumed he would receive a share in the dividends and acquire new property and assets. However, the contract, drafted by a top-class lawyer, prevented Nick from having this opportunity. Despite this, Nick believed the marriage was still beneficial to him, as he would access his wife's finances without control and build up capital for the future. He was going to take money from the common budget on a daily basis and transfer it to his name. But Nick was mistaken in this regard too. Mr. Chinland was a dedicated, decent, and responsible person who not only controlled Jolie's financial flows in business, but also her personal finances. Nick had limited funds for personal expenses, but nevertheless, he remained optimistic about the future and waited to see how the situation would develop. Soon, it turned out that his patience was indeed rewarded. Jolie had been trying to conceive since on their wedding day. Jolie longed for motherhood, but each new cycle brought only bitterness and disappointment. Initially, she attributed her difficulties to nerves and the stress of a frantic lifestyle. She had taken the business into her own hands, learning a lot on the go, which was naturally exhausting. After more than a year of unsuccessful attempts, she sought help from specialists, underwent a full medical examination, and identified the cause of her failures. The symptoms she had attributed to a busy lifestyle turned out to be alarm bells. Her body was warning her of problems, but she had ignored them. Finally, doctors diagnosed her with cancer. She endured almost 2 years of treatment and suffering, but with little success. During this time, Nick played the role of husband only nominally. His vested interest was that Jolie simply did not exist, and he hadn't managed to hide it well enough. Although they never openly discussed it, Jolie was aware of the numerous women her husband had cheated on her with. Nick believed he was adept at conspiracy and manipulation, thinking he was successfully playing the role of a dying wife's husband without arousing suspicion. He felt lucky and thought he only needed to endure a little longer to achieve his desired outcome. However, Nick's behavior was condemned and discussed by everyone, from the nurses in the hospitals where Jolie was treated to Mr. Chinland. The man was furious and helpless. He couldn't comprehend why Jolie would desperately want to preserve her marriage on the brink of the grave. He was also worried that Jolie had no will, which meant her husband automatically became her only heir. Mr. Chinland was sure that Nick would squander all the property within a few years. However, the elderly man was at a loss on how to broach such a delicate subject with his goddaughter, who until recently had emanated health and youth but now had no chance and was dying. The score was counting down to weeks. Nick was already rubbing his greedy hands, his eyes burning with anticipation of getting rid of his frowning and sick wife and acquiring solid capital. It seemed to him that the matter was in the bag. Mr. Chinland prayed that he did not have to start a conversation about the will himself, but fortunately it was not necessary. Jolie started the conversation herself, and her secret left him speechless. She had planned everything meticulously, with finesse and ruthlessness he never expected. Revenge is truly a dish best served cold, and Jolie executed it flawlessly. The way she came up with and realized did not take much effort and time, but completing her journey here on Earth, she realized her main dreams. Unfortunately, Jolie's loved ones did not witness a miracle, and she passed away without recovering. She had arranged the details of her funeral with great care before her death. Serene and resolute, she clearly conveyed her final wishes. The day after the farewell ceremony, the notary called the people mentioned by Jolie in her will and asked them to arrive for its announcement. Nick was shocked by such news. He was sure that his wife had not drawn up any official document in case of her death and that he would become her sole heir as the law usually provides in such cases. Still hoping for the best, he went to the appointed meeting, taking his new mistress, Shirley, who was a striking beauty. Upon entering the notary's office, Nick spotted Mr. Chinland and Jolie's friend Kurt Turgan. But what caught him off guard was that Kurt wasn't alone. He was pushing a stroller with a baby boy inside. Nick was completely unaware of Kurt's marriage or the birth of the child. Although Nick wasn't an expert in any field, he certainly wasn't foolish. It didn't take him long to realize that there was a hidden agenda at play and that he had been outsmarted. Despite this, curiosity overwhelmed him. He wanted to know what Jolie had devised, even though it was already evident that it would be something incredibly humiliating for him. For approximately 15 minutes, everyone remained silent, occupying different corners of the room. No one else arrived. The notary seemed to have deliberately prolonged the introductory part as much as possible, telling them why they had gathered and what an honor it was to read the deceased's last will and testament. Even then, Nick could tell by the wicked gleam in the notary's eyes that something was amiss. Grinning continuously, Mr. Chinland's expression revealed that the will's contents were a secret only to Nick. Finally, Nick heard his name. "To my lawful husband Nick, I deny the inheritance," read the notary. After this modest and short sentence, the notary looked at Nick and asked if he understood the essence of what had been said. Humiliated, Nick had no choice but to nod. At that moment, Shirley took his hand and tried to get up to leave defiantly, but Nick held her in place. She looked at him questioningly, but he ignored her. Despite wanting to flee the scene of his public humiliation as quickly as possible, the play was not over, and the invited audience needed to see it through to the end. After a brief pause, the notary continued, "I bequeath all my personal property to my only son, Robert Turgan. Until he reaches adulthood, I appoint his father, Kurt Turgan, and Mr. Chinland as guardians and administrators of his estate." This shocking revelation hit Nick like a gut punch. "The son from Kurt?" His patience broke and he burst out with a surprised scream. Other than Nick and Shirley, the news didn't surprise anyone present. "Is the boy Jolie's biological child?" Nick asked, gasping for breath and raising his voice. "Yes, Robert is the biological son of Jolie and Kurt," it clarified Mr. Chinland. "She hasn't been pregnant in the last 2 years." "That's impossible." Nick desperately clutched at straws, despite realizing that modern methods didn't require pregnancy to have a child. The godfather smirked, clearly relishing Nick's shock and disappointment. "The advancements in medicine these days are astounding," he remarked. Kurt remembered the horror he felt 2 years ago when he discovered his best friend was seriously ill with little chance of recovery. It was shocking how calmly she spoke about her limited time and what she needed to do. That's when she revealed her desire to become a mother no matter what. "I had my eggs preserved before starting treatment. I was told that I probably wouldn't be able to raise my own child, but I insisted. Kurt, I grew up without a mother, and I know it isn't easy, but I always felt her love and protection." "Does Nick agree to raise the child alone?" Kurt cautiously inquired. "Who would allow him? He would gladly become a guardian and use the baby's money as he lacks conscience." "No, I've already realized that my dear spouse is someone of questionable character, to put it correctly. His reaction to my diagnosis and prognosis, I don't even want to speak about him. This man isn't worth getting upset about." And what about the baby?" Kurt asked. Jolie hesitated, which was unusual for her, as she was usually fearless. "I don't know how to broach the subject delicately. Maybe there is no delicate way. In short, I need you to raise my child," she finally said, looking at Kurt with determination. Kurt was stunned by her request but quickly understood the gravity of the situation. Jolie continued, "I trust you and Mr. Chinland to take care of Robert and ensure that Nick doesn't get his hands on my son's inheritance. I've arranged everything in my will to protect Robert and secure his future." Nick, realizing he had been outsmarted and left with nothing, sat in silence as the reality of his situation sank in. The notary finished reading the will, and Nick's public humiliation was complete. His dreams of easy wealth had evaporated, and he was left to contemplate his future without Jolie's fortune. "I would like you to be the father of my child," Jolie exclaimed in a high-pitched voice. "Are you joking?" "You have a husband," Kurt replied, clearly unprepared for this. "Yes, I do have a husband, and I will have him until the day I die. I've already made that decision. Kurt, of course, we won't sleep together. It's impossible given my current condition. I can't carry the baby myself. Unfortunately, I had my eggs preserved. Now, we need the biological material from the future father. Naturally, I also need a woman to carry and give birth to him, but luckily such services are available now." At first, Kurt thought it was absurd, the nonsensical ramblings of a desperate woman. Yet, she had an entire logical plan in her head and had already completed significant preparatory work, researching the legal aspects, arranging for a reproductive clinic services, and even finding a mother for the future baby. Kurt, I could use the services of a donor for a father for the baby. I really want to leave a piece of myself behind, but when you think about it, who will the baby be with? I've been thinking a lot, but you're the only one I can rely on. I am sure of you. Knowing you for so many years, I believe that you will be a great father. I understand that you want to create your own family, get married, and have children. Naturally, it's logical. But please think about it. Don't answer me right now. For me, after what happened with Nick, it is critical that the father of my child is someone who doesn't prioritize money, someone who won't exploit my assets. I'm not as naive as I was before marriage. Nick taught me a lot. Now, I have a lot of life experience. As for you, you don't need any money at all. You have plenty." "My father has the money," Kurt replied, correcting Jolie's reasoning for the first time. "You know you're going to get it. You work tirelessly to keep the family company thriving. You've never been needy. Now, I know for a fact that a man who grew up poor will never stop thinking about having enough to eat. And if his decency is also lacking, there will be a big problem. I have experienced that firsthand," the woman sadly added. "To be honest, I'm completely confused. I had an entirely different idea of becoming a father. I need to consult my parents. Understand that I can't make such a decision alone. I will need the help of close family members when I become a father, so I have to inform them and ask for their opinion." Jolie had no objection. She only requested that Kurt promise to keep the information secret. The conversation with Kurt's parents was very difficult. His father neutrally accepted everything that was said, listened to all the explanations, and assured Kurt that he would support his son's decision and help as much as he could with his grandchild. His mother, however, was not as open-minded. Like all mothers, she wanted him to marry a good woman and have children together. She felt immense sympathy for Jolie. She had known her from childhood and thought highly of her. But this request? It was very difficult for a mother to accept that her potential grandchild's mother was dying and that the child would be carried by another woman. Can't the child get the disease? The mother dreaded asking, finding it awkward and out of place. However, how else could she ensure her grandson's safety? Jolie does not have a hereditary form of the disease, Kurt answered. This reassured the anxious woman. To some extent, though not completely, Kurt's mother eventually expressed her support for her son's decision after careful consideration. Kurt himself also struggled with indecision. Jolie's proposal caught him off guard, but after some period of contemplation, he concluded that there was no reason to refuse. When he conveyed his approval to Jolie, she was overjoyed, and they began implementing her plan step by step. While Kurt sat and reflected on the life-altering story, Mr. Chinland reminisced about the conversation with Jolie a little over 2 months ago. Starting from afar, she said that she honored Mr. Chinland as a second father and hoped he wouldn't refuse her request. Then she blurted out that she wanted him to become the guardian of her son. Initially, Mr. Chinland thought his goddaughter was delirious, but as Jolie shared the full story, he was left in shock. Not only had Jolie and Kurt made such a bold decision, but they had also hidden it for so long. How old is the baby now? Mr. Chinland asked. Robert is 8 months old, Jolie smiled. You both truly know how to surprise, Mr. Chinland explained, still processing the shock. I don't want Nick to find out about the child before I die. In fact, he will only find out when my will is announced. I've already had it drafted, and it's held with the notary. However, there's one aspect that still needs to be resolved. Robert will have only one parent. I've reassessed many aspects of my life, and I don't want to leave anything to chance. Kurt has parents, so if anything were to happen to him, Robert will go to them. But I want you to have rights too, just in case. Being good at understanding people, the elderly man sensed that it could be too dangerous to act with Nick like this, even though Jolie's husband fully deserved such treatment. Jolie, are you sure this is the way to treat your husband? He's a repugnant man, involving oneself with him means. I mean, why do you need such vengeance from beyond the grave? He expressed his thoughts, then immediately stopped himself. Sorry, dear, for being so rude. You know, I've pondered this for 2 years. I witnessed Robert's birth, saw how Kurt loves him, and his parents adore him. I require nothing else. I have accepted the situation. Currently, I am much more annoyed by those who speak to me about some mystical recovery and healing. And as for Nick, I loved him so deeply, I believed in him with all my heart, but he turned out to be the most ungrateful beast. He comes to my hospital as if it were hard labor. Do you know his girlfriends brought him here? The elderly man silently nodded, bitterness apparent in his expression. And I should forget this? Absolutely not. He cherishes money above all else, so that's how I will punish him. It will be a surprise for him. You see, I kept everything from you. It was immensely difficult. I wanted to introduce you to my son right away, but I was exceedingly cautious so that no one would accidentally find out and tell Nick. This may be my farewell to him. I even wrote him a letter, the notary will deliver it. Mr. Chinland made several attempts to dissuade his goddaughter. It seemed to him like an ill-advised decision, yet the woman maintained her stance, and he had to concede. After all, it is her final will, and it deserves to be respected. Amidst the sudden silence in the notary's office, everyone was engrossed in their own thoughts. You don't need to be a fortune-teller to guess that Nick cursed Jolie in every possible manner. People like him have no inkling that they themselves might be to blame and that others' behavior could be a perfectly logical response. Yet, such introspection is too complex for people like Nick. Why bother searching for problems within oneself? Strangely enough, it was Shirley who interrupted the silence. She tried to take her lover by the elbow to lead him out, but Nick had no intention of leaving as he had not finished speaking. Are you sure that I'm not entitled to anything at all? A mandatory share or whatever it's called? I am the husband, after all, the man shrieked. Even Shirley winced at such behavior, let alone the others present. Only the elderly notary, accustomed to such conduct, remained unsurprised. According to the will, you are not included in the circle of persons entitled to a mandatory share in the inheritance. Moreover, I carefully studied your marriage contract. Its text is attached here. The notary patted the thick folder in front of him with his hand, and you have no chance, even when appealing to the courts. Although you naturally retain the right to such an appeal. Of course I will dispute it. It's unclear who this illegitimate child really is who she claimed as her son. Nick went on a rampage, not realizing what he was saying. Kurt struggled to restrain himself from punching the arrogant man, and even the usually calm Mr. Chinland flushed in anger. Only the notary remained as calm as a python. For him, this was a typical workday and nothing was surprising. He calmly responded, "Attached here are not only the child's birth certificate but also medical documents providing clear answers about his birth. Furthermore, as per the deceased's request, there is a DNA examination result confirming that your wife is the biological mother of Robert Turgan. I should inform you that all documents have been gathered completely and thoroughly." Can I see?" Nick wanted to see the evidence. "No, you can only review the part that pertains to you. All other documents, especially those regarding a child, can only be disclosed with the parent's consent." "Of course, I do not permit it," Kurt immediately interjected. "So it's possible only in a court proceeding if the court deems it necessary to demand these documents," the notary clarified. This was the final straw for Nick. He stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him, vowing not to let this matter rest. His mistress, however, was more polite. She said goodbye and left quietly, closing the door behind her. "Does it matter that he didn't sign that the will was read to him?" Mr. Chinland asked the notary. "There are many like him. It's nothing more than a formality," the notary reassured him. "It would be funny if it weren't so sad." "I still don't understand how Jolie got involved with him," Mr. Chinland said his thoughts aloud, but his question remained rhetorical. The men quickly signed the necessary documents and shook hands. Mr. Chinland helped Kurt put little Robert into the stroller. "Will you join us?" "I want to take a walk, get some fresh air, and it's good for the baby," Kurt asked. "Certainly, I'll join for a while." They walked in silence, listening to the rustle of the stroller wheels. "Do you think Jolie would be satisfied with how I'm coping?" Kurt finally asked, revealing what had been bothering him. "I'm sure of it. You're a wonderful father, and it's clear to see how much you both mean to each other," Jolie's godfather reassured him. "To be honest, there's one thing I can't get out of my head. You know, I think Jolie told you that I advised her against what just happened at the notary's office." "Are you talking about this circus?" And angry, but he resolved to take action. Determined to reclaim some semblance of dignity and control, he decided to pursue the matter through legal channels. Nick began researching inheritance laws, seeking any loophole that might allow him to challenge Jolie's will. Despite his lack of legal knowledge, he convinced himself that he could find a way to overturn her last wishes and secure at least a portion of her estate. Meanwhile, Kurt and Mr. Chinland continued to care for little Robert, focusing on fulfilling Jolie's final wishes. They had grown closer during this challenging period, forming a bond over their shared responsibility and love for the child. Both men were determined to provide Robert with a stable and loving home, as Jolie had wanted. As Nick's efforts to contest the will dragged on, he found himself entangled in a web of legal complexities and mounting expenses. He hired an attorney, spending what little money he had left on legal fees, but each attempt to challenge the will was met with strong opposition from Kurt and Mr. Chinland's legal team. The courts upheld Jolie's meticulously crafted will, leaving Nick with nothing. Shirley, having moved on with her life, had no interest in reconnecting with Nick. She had quickly realized that he was not the wealthy, successful man he pretended to be. Her departure left Nick feeling more isolated and desperate than ever. Nick's health continued to deteriorate as he spiraled further into alcoholism. His anger and bitterness consumed him, and he became a shadow of his former self. The man who once believed he could manipulate and deceive his way to wealth now faced the harsh reality of his choices. One day, while wandering aimlessly through the city, Nick happened upon a playground. He watched as children played, their laughter and joy contrasting starkly with his own misery. Among the children, he spotted Kurt and Mr. Chinland with Robert, who was now a lively toddler. They appeared happy and content, a stark reminder of what he had lost. Seeing Robert, the child he had once dismissed and scorned, thriving in the care of others stirred something within Nick. He felt a pang of regret, a fleeting moment of clarity amidst the fog of his despair. But it was too late for redemption. The damage he had caused was irreversible, and the life he had envisioned for himself was nothing more than a shattered illusion. As Nick walked away from the playground, he realized that he had no one to blame but himself. The choices he had made, driven by greed and selfishness, had led him to this point. In his pursuit of wealth and power, he had lost everything that truly mattered. With this bleak realization, Nick faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale of the destructive power of arrogance and deceit. Meanwhile, Kurt and Mr. Chinland continued to honor Jolie's memory by raising Robert with love and dedication. They ensured that he knew about his mother's bravery and the sacrifices she had made. Despite the challenges they faced, they found solace in the bond they shared and the promise they had made to Jolie. In the end, Jolie's meticulous planning and the unwavering support of her loved ones ensured that her legacy lived on through her son, free from the influence of those who sought to exploit her. Her story, marked by strength and resilience, served as a testament to the enduring power of love and the importance of cherishing what truly matters in life. For his sinister plan, Nick's obsession grew, driving him to meticulous preparation. He was relentless, knowing that this act of revenge was his last chance to inflict pain on Jolie from beyond the grave. Each day, he watched from his hidden vantage point, learning Robert's routine and the habits of Kurt and Mr. Chinland. He noted when they left the house, who they interacted with, and any potential security measures they had in place. He even timed their walks and visits to the park, observing every detail with a chilling determination. Nick's rage fueled his focus. His thoughts were consumed by the imagined suffering of Jolie, helpless to intervene from the afterlife. He visualized the terror and confusion that Robert would experience, and the anguish it would cause those who loved him. This vision kept him going, even as he grappled with the logistics of his plan. Despite his careful planning, Nick's deteriorating mental state made him prone to reckless decisions. He became increasingly paranoid, fearing that his intentions might be discovered. Every shadow in the forest seemed like a potential threat, and every rustle of leaves a sign of someone watching. Yet, he pressed on, driven by a singular, malevolent purpose. On the day he decided to act, Nick felt an eerie calm. He packed a small bag with essentials: food, water, a change of clothes, and a few basic tools. He wore dark clothing to blend into the shadows and covered his face with a mask. As evening approached, he slipped through the forest towards the Turgis house, his heart pounding with anticipation. Kurt, Mr. Chinland, and little Robert were in the backyard, enjoying the cool evening air. Kurt was playing with Robert, lifting him into the air and spinning him around while the baby giggled. Mr. Chinland watched them with a warm smile, finding solace in these moments despite the recent turmoil. Nick waited until dusk, when the light began to fade. He crept closer, staying low to the ground and using the trees as cover. He saw Kurt carrying Robert towards the house, preparing to put him to bed. As they reached the back door, Nick made his move. He darted from his hiding spot, rushing towards them with startling speed. Kurt barely had time to react before Nick was upon him, shoving him aside and grabbing Robert from his arms. The baby started to cry, sensing the danger and unfamiliarity of the situation. Kurt! Help! Mr. Chinland shouted, trying to intervene, but Nick was already running towards the forest, holding Robert tightly. Kurt scrambled to his feet, his heart racing with fear and anger. He chased after Nick, shouting for help and calling the security guards. Nick ran through the forest, dodging branches and roots, his lungs burning with exertion. Robert's cries echoed in his ears, but he pressed on, driven by the image of Jolie's suffering. He reached his hidden car, a beat-up sedan parked off a secluded dirt road, and fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. As he was about to start the engine, Kurt caught up, grabbing the door handle and yanking it open. Give me my son! Kurt yelled, trying to wrestle Robert from Nick's grip. Nick lashed out, striking Kurt with a desperate, wild blow. But Kurt's determination was stronger. Fueled by love and fear for Robert's safety, he fought back with all his strength. In the struggle, Nick lost his grip on Robert, who fell into Kurt's arms. Holding his son tightly, Kurt backed away, his eyes blazing with protective fury. Nick, realizing he had failed, sank to the ground, gasping for breath. Security guards arrived moments later, apprehending him and ensuring he couldn't escape. Kurt hugged Robert close, tears of relief streaming down his face. Mr. Chinland arrived, having followed the commotion. He placed a reassuring hand on Kurt's shoulder. "You did it, Kurt. You saved him." As the police took Nick away, he glared at Kurt and Mr. Chinland with a mixture of hatred and despair. His plan had failed, and now he faced the consequences of his actions. For Kurt, Mr. Chinland, and little Robert, life would eventually return to a semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of Nick's malevolence would serve as a reminder of the fragility of their peace and the enduring power of love and family in the face of adversity. Hidden within the forest, allowing him to keep a close watch on the area. He had noticed the suspicious behavior of Nick during his surveillance and had been on alert for any unusual activity. On that critical Wednesday, the gamekeeper had been shadowing Nick, waiting for him to make his move. As Nick lay on the ground, the gamekeeper quickly checked on the nanny and Robert. The nanny was unconscious but breathing, and Robert, still strapped in the stroller, was crying but unharmed. The gamekeeper called the security team from the settlement and explained the situation. Within minutes, security personnel and an ambulance arrived, securing Nick and attending to the nanny. Nick, now restrained and semi-conscious, was taken to the nearest police station. The authorities quickly pieced together the evidence: his surveillance notes, the stolen car with false plates, and the stun gun. Nick's premeditated plan was laid bare, and his motive was clear. The police notified Kurt and Mr. Chinland about the incident. Kurt was overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. He rushed to the police station to ensure Robert was safe and to thank the gamekeeper for his timely intervention. Mr. Chinland accompanied him, both men shaken by how close they had come to a disaster. At the police station, Nick sat in a holding cell, his anger and frustration mounting. He realized his plan had failed spectacularly and that he was now facing serious charges. His thoughts of revenge had backfired, leaving him with nothing but a long prison sentence ahead. Kurt and Mr. Chinland, holding Robert tightly, met with the gamekeeper to express their profound thanks. Kurt, eyes brimming with tears, said, "You saved my son's life. I can't thank you enough. We owe you everything." The gamekeeper, a humble man, replied, "I was just doing my job. I'm glad I could help." That man was trouble from the start. As the legal process unfolded, Nick was charged with attempted kidnapping, assault, and a host of related crimes. His trial was swift, given the overwhelming evidence against him. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, ensuring he could no longer pose a threat to Robert or anyone else. Life gradually returned to normal for Kurt, Mr. Chinland, and little Robert. They remained vigilant, but the fear that had gripped them began to dissipate. The nanny, after a period of recovery, returned to her duties, more cautious but determined to protect Robert. For Kurt, the incident reinforced the preciousness of his son and the importance of family. He devoted even more time to Robert, cherishing every moment they spent together. Mr. Chinland, too, became a constant presence, providing support and wisdom. As the years passed, Robert grew into a happy, healthy child, surrounded by love and security. The shadow of Nick's malevolence faded, replaced by the warmth of a family united by adversity. Kurt often thought of Jolie, feeling her presence in Robert's bright eyes and infectious laughter. He was determined to honor her memory by raising their son with all the love and care she had hoped for. And so, despite the dark chapter of Nick's vengeful plot, the story ended on a note of resilience and hope. The strength of family bonds and the enduring power of love triumphed, ensuring a bright future for Robert and those who loved him. Mr. Mayo listened attentively as Kurt recounted the intricate and tumultuous events that had unfolded in his life. He nodded thoughtfully, occasionally interjecting with a question or a sympathetic remark. Kurt felt a sense of relief in sharing his story with someone who was not directly involved, someone who could offer a fresh perspective. As Kurt described Jolie's illness, their decision to preserve her eggs, and the subsequent plan for Robert's birth, Mr. Mayo's expression shifted from curiosity to deep empathy. He could sense the weight of Kurt's emotions and the complexity of the situation involving Nick's vengeful actions. When Kurt mentioned Nick's motives for revenge, Mr. Mayo leaned forward, his brow furrowing in concern. "It's a terrible thing when hatred takes hold of someone's heart," he remarked solemnly. "People can do unimaginable things when they're driven by such emotions." Kurt nodded sadly. "Yes, it's been a nightmare. Jolie wanted to protect Robert from Nick's influence, from his greed and manipulation. She never imagined he would resort to such extremes. Mr. Mayo remained silent for a moment, processing everything he had heard. "You've been through so much," he finally said. "And Robert, he's fortunate to have you looking out for him." Kurt managed a small smile. "Thank you. I'm trying my best." Jolie would have wanted him to have a good life, free from all this drama. "I can see that," Mr. Mayo replied warmly. "You're a good father, Kurt. And you've handled all of this with remarkable strength." Kurt appreciated the words of encouragement. It was reassuring to hear that from someone like Mr. Mayo, who had witnessed a different kind of adversity in his life in the woods, away from the chaos of human emotions. He realized that sharing his story had been cathartic, helping him process his own feelings and gain a clearer perspective. As the evening wore on, Kurt and Mr. Mayo continued their conversation, discussing lighter topics like the local wildlife and the tranquility of living in such a secluded area. Kurt felt a sense of peace settling over him, knowing that Robert was safe and that there were people like Mr. Mayo watching out for others in the community. Eventually, Kurt bid Mr. Mayo farewell, promising to keep in touch and express his gratitude again. As he drove back home with Robert sleeping peacefully in the back seat, Kurt reflected on the events of the day. He felt a renewed sense of hope and resilience, knowing that even in the face of darkness, there were good people like Mr. Mayo who would step forward to protect what was right. And so, with each passing day, Kurt focused on building a loving and stable environment for Robert. Honoring Jolie's memory and cherishing the unexpected bonds of kindness and support that had emerged from the turmoil of their lives. As time passed and life settled into a new rhythm for Kurt and Robert, the presence of Mr. Mayo became a comforting constant. His visits and genuine care for Robert added a layer of security and warmth to their lives, reinforcing the sense of family beyond biological ties. Kurt found solace in Mr. Mayo's perspective during their conversations. The gamekeeper's blunt honesty about Nick's actions and motivations helped Kurt reconcile his own feelings of guilt and responsibility. Mr. Mayo's reassurance that Nick's choices were his own, driven by deep-seated flaws rather than external influences, allowed Kurt to release the burden of self-blame. Their friendship deepened as Mr. Mayo continued to watch over Robert, fulfilling his promise to Jolie in spirit. The Chinese belief Mr. Mayo mentioned about saving a life resonated deeply with Kurt, reinforcing the idea that they were all bound together by their shared responsibility and love for Robert. Meanwhile, life took a positive turn for Kurt personally. He met a single mother at Robert's kindergarten, and their children quickly bonded. Kurt's parents, hopeful for his happiness, welcomed this new chapter in his life, envisioning a loving future where Robert would have not just a stepmother, but potentially siblings as well. Throughout it all, Kurt remained steadfast in keeping Jolie's memory alive for Robert. He shared stories, showed pictures, and reminded Robert daily of his mother's enduring love and protection. It was a promise he intended to keep, ensuring that Robert grew up knowing the depth of his mother's love, even in her absence. As for Nick, justice was served with a lengthy prison sentence. His absence brought a sense of closure and security to Kurt and Robert's lives, allowing them to finally breathe a sigh of relief after enduring so much turmoil and uncertainty. In the quiet moments, when Kurt watched Robert play or saw him smile, he knew that despite the challenges they had faced, they had come through stronger together. And with Mr. Mayo's steadfast presence, Robert had not just a guardian angel watching over him, but a devoted friend who embodied the true meaning of family.